Inquilinos Boricuas en Acción in the South End. And I'm very honored to be able to sit in the panel, as IBA is a long-standing partner of BPS. And currently we have a partnership with the Blackstone Community School, in which we have an after-school and summer learning program at the school for first and second grade English language learners. So it's very exciting to be here as part of this community partner panel. I'd like to start first by welcoming everyone here in the audience, as well as those of you joining us live through Boston City TV. This is our last forum for the search of the BPS superintendent. And I want to remind everyone here and through live stream that you could send questions or feedback to via email to the superintendent search at bostonpublicschools.org. So make sure that you provide any feedback there if you're not able to ask your questions today. Today, we'll have the opportunity to hear from, to ask questions to, and to weigh in on the last and final candidate for the position of Boston Public Schools Superintendent, Dr. Oscar Santos. Our thank you goes to Mayor Walsh and the Boston School Committee for providing all of us the opportunity to weigh in this public manner, as well as the rest of the people in the city of Boston. I also want to give my sincere thanks to the search committee led by an esteemed friend, Alexandra Oliver Davila, and her co-chair, Dr. Keith Motley. Our job is being made easier by the hard work of the search committee, in which they narrowed down a very extensive and impressive pool of candidates to our final three. So my job today is to moderate this panel and allow sufficient time for each of the panelists, as well as the public, to ask their questions. There's BPS staff in the room, and they are distributing cards, so if you have questions, please put them in the card. We'll make our best effort to answer all of the questions, depending on the time. So as we get started, first of all, let me welcome you, Dr. Santos, to this community partner panel. And I want to introduce you first to my colleague panelists around this table. I would like to start on my left with Kristen McSwain, who many of you know as the Executive Director of the Boston Opportunity Agenda. But Kristen is also a BPS parent and a BPS spouse. So thank you, Kristen. I want to continue to my right, introducing Sean Brown, who is the Executive Director of Becoming a Man. And lastly, Anthony Benoit, who is the President of the Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology. Before we get started, I would like to give the audience a brief introduction to your extensive bio, Dr. Santos, so people have a good sense of who you are and your experience. However, if you go to bostonpublicschools.org/superintendent search, you will be able to find more information about Dr. Santos' bio and experience. Dr. Oscar Santos is a transformative urban educator. He was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, and is a proud graduate of Boston Public Schools. He is the son of a single mother who immigrated to Boston from the Dominican Republic with the belief that education was the key to a better life for her children. With her support and guidance, he attended and graduated from Boston Latin School and continued on to Boston College, where he received a Bachelor of Arts degree in English and History. And from there, he has a quite impressive professional background, so I invite you all to read more about his experience. Before we proceed with the questions from our panel, I want to give Dr. Santos the opportunity to give us some opening remarks briefly.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Vanessa, thank you very much for having me here. Good morning, Anthony. Good morning, Sean, and good morning, Kristen. It's nice to be here. As you mentioned, my name is Oscar Santos. I was born and raised in Boston. I am a proud graduate of the Boston Public Schools. After graduating from college, I did 2 years of national service with AmeriCorps. In 1996, I became a teacher at English High School, and I taught English, history, college readiness, and then I was able to teach English language learners with students who had interrupted education, as well as ESL, and it was something that I truly, truly enjoyed. In 2003, I became a Boston Principal Fellow, which was a program to prepare young leaders to become principals, and I did a year-long internship at the Washington Irving Middle School, which was a school that was in corrective action at that point for a year. From 2004 to 2010, I was able to run a school that was specifically designed for English language learners. It's a place that I absolutely love. The name of the school is called Boston International High School. When I arrived there, it was only a program, and we made sure that we converted it into a fully accredited school, which is what the school and the families and the students wanted. In 2010, I became superintendent of schools in Randolph, Massachusetts, a district that was about to be taken over by the state. And we did a lot of good work there. Stayed there till 2013. And then I had a wonderful opportunity to come back to the city of Boston, where I've been the head of a school for students that are inner city Boston kids. 92% of our kids come from the city of Boston, inner city kids from Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan. And my job is to raise money for inner city kids to make sure they get a great education. Just one thing that I wanted to mention during my time in Boston, I also led the ELL task force, and I was also the initial co-chair for the Achievement Gap policy work that began in 2005, and I also had an opportunity to be on the negotiation teams. I'm excited to be here, but I would be remiss if I did not say the things that I'm most proud of, which is being married for 20 years and having a wonderful son named Jackson, who is about to turn 16, and my daughter Sophia, who's about to turn 13. So looking forward to having a conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santos. The way we will moderate the panel today, we'll give an opportunity to all the panelists to ask a question, at least 2 questions, maybe more depending on the time, and then we'll open it to the public to answer the questions that may come from the public this morning.
Great.
Okay? So I would like to start with Kristen Swain.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome, and we're happy to have you here today. So one of the things that we've been talking about as a community panel over the last couple of days are the rich assets that Boston has in terms of partners. We've got businesses who are very interested, particularly our STEM businesses. We've got our cultural institutions. We've got all of the nonprofits who are in our community, both the small grassroots ones and the larger AmeriCorps programs. And so when we think about partnerships for BPS, it should be pretty easy. There's lots of partners, there's lots of schools. But over time, we've never really experienced equity in the distribution of those resources, or in terms of how principals find partners and connect. And so really looking to you to hear what your vision would be for community partners like us engaging with Boston Public Schools, and specifically the kinds of operational things that you would implement to make that happen so all of our young people have access to the world-class city that we live in.
You are 100% correct. As a person who grew up and has been raised in Boston and has built many relationships over my 25 years as an educator, you're 100% correct about the incredible resources that we have in the city of Boston. Just in the local area, we have 38 colleges, 138,000 college and graduate students. We have 23 Boston Public Libraries. We have Boys and Girls Clubs. There's so many great organizations. And that is just one of the strengths of Boston. And I think it's an incredible opportunity to really think about what are the needs of the schools and how do we support that in a real intentional and purposeful manner. One of the things that I saw that was really interesting in terms of the work that Boston is doing with equity is the Opportunity Index. And I think that when you have an Opportunity Index where you're looking at data, you can give the opportunities to the principals and to the schools and to the ILTs to say, what are the specific needs that you have as a school that are really impeding you from achieving equity and access and eliminating the achievement and opportunity gaps. And to really have an intentional approach from the district level to support some of the needs to make sure that they're directed and focused. I was fortunate from 1996 to 2010 to be in the Boston Public Schools, and one of the things that I think Dr. Payson did really well was when he had the focus on children in the instructional core, was to make sure that the partnerships and the programs that we put forth were extensively and critically aligned to the work that was happening in the district. As a superintendent in Randolph, that's one of the things that I did. We made sure that with our Director of Family and Community Engagement, we reached out to the Nellie Mae Foundation. We did an after-school program that was called Springboard, and the program was connected to kids' needs so that we looked at their academics and where they were. And then last but not least, as running a philanthropy-based school, one of the things that I'm really charged with is making sure that we leverage partners for our students, where our students get explicit opportunities to have internships with Fidelity Investments, Wilmer Hale, early college programs with Framingham State, and it's about being as intentional as possible. If I were to be chosen in this incredible position, I would make sure that we have an innovation and entrepreneurship director to really align those practices and systems and to make sure that they're equitable, because it can't just be that one person is doing something off the side and another person's not, and that's how you build scale, where let's just say you work with Northeastern, which is something that Cathedral's doing right now, where we're doing an applied learning model, that's something that 2 or 3 schools can do. So it's about using the interdependence to support those programs.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Tony?
Good morning, Dr. Santos. Thank you. Good afternoon, actually, I think. As you know, Boston Public Schools continue to suffer from opportunity gaps across race, language, neighborhood, academic background, alternate abilities, and on. I'm curious what you see your role as superintendent in closing those gaps. And you could talk both about sort of strategies that you think would be effective and how, as superintendent, you would implement those.
Sure. In terms of opportunity and achievement gaps, and in many ways, gender and economic gaps too. One of the things that really, as a lifelong Bostonian, understanding that our city has changed so much. You have places like East Boston and Dorchester where the rents and the property values have increased incredibly, and that's difficult for our families. When you look at the color of income or the wealth gap that exists in Boston, it's heartbreaking where you see the average assets of an African-American family being $700, for Latino families maybe about $2,000, and then for what you would call Caucasian families, about $256,000. So those are real pressures that families feel on a daily basis. As a superintendent, my first job is to make sure that people understand that that's real, that impacts how kids learn, that impacts how kids come to school on a daily basis, that in some cases, some kids may not have the resources that are necessary, or that they came and didn't have breakfast in the morning. So those are important things that just make you understand that on a day-to-day basis, you have to support kids and meet them where they are. Secondly, I think the other thing that I would do that I have done and I think is incredibly important is to make sure that the staff and the students are known. When you know a student, when teachers know kids and they know their backgrounds, Doug Reeves did some amazing work on the 90-90 schools where kids were 3 times more likely to be successful. So I think that that's an important piece that needs to be done. And then as you look at some of the strategies, going back to the conversation we just had speaking with Kristen, it's about creating opportunity zones in the city of Boston. When you look at partnerships and you look at the pre-K programs and after-school programs, is to make sure that those are aligned with the schools so that they're equitable, service-oriented, and supporting the schools. And the other thing that I don't want to leave out is that it's important to make sure you include the families, because we have a lot of young families that are really working hard. I know I saw this very much. I see it a lot at Cathedral, at Boston International, where families have 2 jobs just to pay the rent, and they don't have the time or the resources. So we need to do what I would call some relational automation. And what I mean by that is to make sure something that You Aspire does with kids is to connect them, to have ways to use text messaging and technology to let families and kids know, here are the programs, here are the opportunities. People don't have time to sit down and read and do all the things that sometimes we take for granted. So it's about making things quick and making them functional so that families and students can have access.
Thank you. Sean.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Santos. The district has acknowledged the school to prison pipeline and has been intentional in its efforts to work both internally and with community partners to address and dismantle the school to prison pipeline. So I'll preface my question around highlighting 3 data points from the district's study. The first being the district reports 32% of black scholars, and when I say scholars, I mean males, and 37% of Latino scholars were chronically absent from the BPS at the time of this study. 10% of black scholars and 6% of Latino scholars are suspended annually from the district. In Boston, suspension rates of young men of color are 3 times higher than that of white males. Why is that important? The 2 data points are important because research shows students who are suspended and disengaged are more likely to be left back and dropped out of school, and result of that is end up in the juvenile justice system. So my question is, but before that, 68% of youth convicted by the juvenile justice system are black or Latino, despite making up only 10% of the state population. So my question is, what's your commitment around the school to prison pipeline? How do you plan to build on the work the district has already started, and what role do you see community partners playing in that?
Sean, you're bringing up a very near and dear topic to me as a Latino male growing up in Boston, and not just reading about this, but living it and understanding that I've had friends that have gone through that process, and that's difficult and hard. And when you go to school and you end up in a prison pipeline, that's unacceptable. That was a challenge I faced in Randolph. It was a challenge that we had at English High School, and I can give you some specifics about what I did at English High School and some of the other places, but I'll start with as a teacher. At English High School, we had a number of students who were considered the most likely to be suspended or to get in trouble. One of the things that I did was I went to the headmaster at the time. I asked him if myself and 2 other student teachers could do a young men's program. I will tell you that I'm so proud of the fact that all of those students graduated, and more importantly, they raised money for a basketball game, because some of these students were athletes, for a battered women's shelter. And the reason why that's important to me, and I'm proud of that, is because we engage students in solving the problems and letting them know that they had assets and values, and that they could bring some of that to the forefront. One of the things that I had that was difficult for me as superintendent in Randolph was that in some cases I felt that the police was getting too involved in the discipline of kids. And I know the law pretty well. You bring in police when there's a controlled substance or if there's a dangerous weapon. If not, those are school-related issues. When you put school-related issues or disciplinary issues and address that to knock students, that's where the problems begin. I believe very much in restorative justice, in bringing kids back into this community and making sure that they understand that, yes, you made a mistake, and that these are things that we need to work on. I'm a huge believer in cooperative discipline, making sure that kids are capable, that they feel connected in the classroom, that they're cared for. And if you do that, those discipline problems are decreased. As superintendent, I would work very closely with the police department, with Commissioner Gross, as well as with this team, to make sure that we do proactive work with the community and with young men and young women and the entire city of Boston, because it helps us all to feel better and be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santos. This is a great segue to open for some questions from the public, and in fact, there are some questions from the public around restorative justice.
Sure.
And one of them is, what is your understanding of restorative justice, and are you committed to helping to create a whole school approach to restorative justice that goes beyond responses to harm and builds genuine school learning communities that prevent harm in the first place?
So the first part, my understanding and the way that I view restorative justice is to make sure that when something goes wrong, you bring the person back, you discuss it, you use it as a teachable moment, and that you re-engage back into the community in a way that allows you to be your full self as well as the adults. In terms of going beyond restorative justice for what I would say the social emotional aspects of education, it's just to make sure that a community, a school community, is a place of learning and care, and that you have young people involved in doing some of the restorative justice. One of the things that I'm really proud of that we did at Cathedral is that when students get in trouble, there's a planning center, and this is a place where young people are able to go identify and say, I need some support, and there are adults there that support people before, young men and women, before they actually may get into problems. So that's a proactive approach that I think is really critical. And then secondly, to make sure that problems and challenges are addressed at the school level and that they're made known so that you use peers, young people to support each other and to include the families as well, because these are real critical issues that may impact a young person, but it's about having a holistic approach that a school is a safe place of learning, it's a place where you can be cared for, and it's a place where you feel that you're part of a community. Just a tidbit of information, when the Gates Foundation did a great study on what makes a great school in 2004, one of the key highlight was that if a student feels that he or she is in trouble, that they can at least go find one or two adults to let them know that. So it's about building relationships and making sure that young people understand that there's people there that care for them.
Good. So let me ask a follow-up question from the public as well around the same topic. The question goes as this. We currently have a National Institute of Justice funded whole school preventive approach to restorative justice in 30 schools that will end in a year. Would you be committed to prioritizing this work within BPS? And would you be committed to support the staffing budget in order to carry this work forward?
So in terms of my core values on restorative justice, I would fight for it 100%, and I believe that it needs to be in the schools. In terms of the budget process, I would make it a budget priority. But like anything else, going back to the discussion that we've had a little bit in terms of the city of Boston is how do we use that wealth of what I would say human capital and resources that we have to create grants and opportunities if we don't have the funding for it, because sometimes we can't fund everything, but to me it's a core value. It's something that I would advocate for 100%.
Very good, thank you. So let me turn it back to the panel and then go back to public questions. Maybe we can start with you, Sean, this time?
Yes, that's fine. The district prioritizes academic outcomes, but we recognize students as whole people who need well-rounded growth. What would your goal be around social-emotional development for the district, individual schools, and/or youth, and how does a community partnership play into that?
Sean, the reason why I'm here is because of social-emotional learning. As a young kid growing up in Boston and being at the Rafael Hernandez and not having some of the resources and some of the needs, those were the things that helped me, going to the Bird Street Youth Center, having the Boston Public Library, the tutoring programs, the TAG program to help me when I got into Latin school. So to me, my firm commitment to social-emotional learning is about creating safety, support, meeting kids where they are, and supporting them all the way throughout. If you think about learning and you think about Maslow's hierarchy of safety, if you're not safe, there's no learning that's going to go on. And to me, that's what schools are about. Learning is great, and making sure that kids are learning math, English, history, science, all those things are important. I love academics. Those academic outcomes are important. But I will tell you that having a great person, having a person that is collaborative, having a person that's caring, having a person that's honest, that can be of value to others, that to me is just as important. My commitment to that would be to make sure that all schools have social-emotional learning within their programs of study. I can tell you that in Randolph, one of the things that I was most proud of is many of our young kids were, unfortunately, at a young age, sometimes misdiagnosed as perhaps special education or certain labels were placed on students. I wrote a grant that we got $1.6 million for to make sure that every single school had a social worker, every single elementary school. And I was so proud of that because there were a lot of families who unfortunately did not know what was going on with some of their students. And one of the things that, going back to knowing your students, when you misdiagnose a student, that could have a huge impact on a person for the rest of their lives. So that's something that I would really advocate for and make sure that it is woven into the DNA of our schools.
Thank you.
Tony?
Thank you. So the Boston Public Schools, like any large organization, depends on stakeholders and participants who often bring great strengths and can be very effective. At the same time, those stakeholders may have a greater or lesser interest in maintaining the status quo. So I'm curious how, as superintendent, you would work to engage the strengths of those groups and work to minimize any harmful effects of resistance.
In terms of stakeholders wanting to go against the status quo, Anthony, I think that that's a good thing to listen to them and find out. And if we look at the status quo right now, it's not good enough. And you know, when you look at graduation rates, when you look at equity issues, when you look at college completion, workforce development, so I think it's good to have a little bit of let's go against the status quo, because I believe that, and that's important. In terms of making sure that you have a clear sense of how to support those stakeholders, is to come back to the goals of the district. It was really clearly articulated in the job description to close and eliminate the achievement gaps for the city of Boston, to bring the community together and to have a cohesive plan and a strategy to support the work that needs to happen to make Boston a model for excellence. I would say to any of our stakeholders who are against the status quo, let's look at where you are against the status quo so that I can push with you and support you. Allies, listening and having a team is absolutely critical. I can give you just a small example. When I was at Cathedral, when I first arrived at Cathedral, one of the things that we wanted to do was create an applied learning model. And what I mean by that is make our school much more of a 21st century school. We reached out to Dell, to Autodesk. We did a full visioning session with students, with parents, with teachers, because they had to have voice and ownership in it. Some people didn't know what it was. Same thing with partnerships and people who want something against the status quo. The key is to bring them together, focus it on the work that needs to be done and support it.
Thank you. Kristen, then we jump back.
So one of the things that you've touched on is the need for a comprehensive plan and strategy. And you also talked about budget and resources being constrained. And so, you know, given that Boston has, over this last budget cycle, had schools that have lost things like social workers and nurses or special education teachers, what would be your plan for addressing those kinds of needs, as well as moving beyond sort of the baseline of what a school needs into the kinds of things you just described for the 21st century learning, right? So how would you make that happen, not at an individual school basis, but at a system level?
Yeah. Kristen, that's important to think systemically in terms of when we talk about how do we support the entire district of Boston. My mantra and my philosophy is one Boston, one focus, great schools for all. And what I mean by that is that the city of Boston does not have one sector of the city that's so much more advanced or better resourced than another. And I think that that's something that can be addressed through opportunity index and really being clear with families and with schools about here are the base needs. If there's some schools that can do more, great, we appreciate you, we support you. If you have community partners and our parents or others who are raising money, that's excellent. But equity does not mean that everybody gets exactly the same. So to me, part of it is to make sure that the budget is a representation of your values and that you bring the entire school district together, that you sit down with your principals, that you sit down with the central offices to talk about what are the things that are important. For example, the mass core is something that needs to be done for all high schools. If schools want to do more, that's excellent. Challenges that I see, with the teachers union has this whole wonderful idea about creating hub schools so that there's more social workers, that there's more guidance counselors. I support that, and I believe that it's looking at what are the needs, what are the trigger points that are not there, what are the financial restraints that we have, and how do we leverage the city? and how do we leverage the community partners and hospitals that we have in the city of Boston and the ed schools to support some of that. And then last but not least, we really do have to talk about the fact that the city of Boston gets about $220 million from state aid and from Chapter 70, and about $167 million of that goes to the charters. That's something that I'm concerned about. That happened in Randolph. We had a lot of our money going to the charter schools. And, from the way I read it, and I think Preston Green from University of Connecticut probably says it best, we need to resource all of our public schools at the max capacity and then support our charters. So that to me is important. I understand that people need choice and resources, but resources are something that I would advocate for the Boston Public Schools, because the budget is something that we would have to own to support those needs. And that would be the way I would go about that, Kristen.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let me turn it over now to some of the questions from the public, because we have a few. The next question is about special education, and it goes like this. What is your vision for special education inclusion programs, specifically staffing of inclusion classes?
My sense of special education is that you want to make sure that students have the least restrictive environment and that they are in a classroom with their peers so that they can get high quality instruction as much as possible. One of the things that I did in Randolph was I took this directly head on as the superintendent in Randolph. When I took over as the superintendent in Randolph, one of the things that the state cited Randolph for was the fact that they were not working well with special education students. And in many ways, it was an exclusive process. The kids were not being included into the classroom. That's something that fundamentally went against my values. And what I did was I looked at the data, I had conversations, we took the central offices for walks so that we can calibrate and say, how is this helping young people learn when they're being pushed out of a classroom and they don't know what exactly is going on, and then they're not getting access to quality education. So I took that on directly, and we made sure that we hired assistant principals that were trained in special education, and we trained all of our teachers in UDL, Universal Design Learning, with Thomas Hare. And we really pushed for making sure that that it was much more inclusive. As a result, one of the things that came forth was that our per pupil index for our highest need populations rose from 39 to 64 over the time that I was in Randolph. So it's something that I believe we need to push for a much more inclusive environment for special education.
Very good, thank you. And another important piece in addition to special education is early childhood education. And we know that it's a key time right now at the city of Boston, and it's an important time also and phase for the children's development to experience safe and enriching environments. BPS has been working with partners to build infrastructure for capacity and quality pre-K environments across the city, but many challenges remain. Considering your many priorities as a potential superintendent, how do you view early childhood needs in BPS, and what do you see as your role in implementing UPK?
Early childhood education is the #1 indicator for success for young people. And to me, that is such a great opportunity to support achievement opportunity gaps. It's making sure that kids are getting a safe, caring, and academic social environment as early as possible. One of the things that I did in Randolph was we did full day kindergarten. We fought for that, and that was something that I was really proud of. And in addition to that, we also hired early education literacy coaches for students, and we extended our day for kids all the way kindergarten through grade 5, which was important. As a superintendent, that would be something that I would advocate for 100%. And the research is out there. The Tennessee STAR Project, one of the largest studies ever done on early pre-K, which followed students for 13 years, showed that those pre-K years were so critical for kids in terms of doing well academically, graduating from high school, going on to college. So to me, that's the #1 indicator. In terms of the operational aspects of working with the community providers, I think it's about training, and it's about making sure that the programs and the opportunities that we're providing with our providers, that they're quality, that they're certified, and that would be the job of the school district, myself, and the early childhood education program to make sure that they're aligned. So that would be the way that I would approach that.
Very good, thank you. Let's just give it another question from the public and turn it back to the panels, and we have a few more after. Boston is successful in development of affordable housing using a system of community development corporations, or CDCs, like EBA.
Sure.
BPS is to schools and education what BHA is to affordable housing in the city. Yet, we don't ask BHA to do affordable housing everywhere. Would you consider a distributed network of place-based partners to serve as neighborhood of advocates for local networks of schools?
Vanessa, can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. So the question is based on, I think the person is comparing both BPS as a network of schools and BHA and CDCs as networks of affordable housing
Yep.
developments. So the question is, would you consider a distributed network of place-based partners to serve as neighborhood advocates for local networks of school? I think this goes a little bit back to the community partnership question.
I would, and I believe that it's critical because when you look at the city of Boston, and it's an equitable challenge in terms of making sure that BHA as well as other organizations are supporting the community of Boston as we see the income disparity and the challenges that exist in the city of Boston. And it would be something that I would advocate for. I would look for leaders like yourself and others to help guide some of that work, because we do need to have those types of programs to support what I would say more economic challenge and more economic places to support inner city kids and the community.
Good. So let me turn it over back to our panel and see, Kristen, question for Dr. Santos.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we've talked about over the past couple of days are the balancing act that Boston Public Schools plays between sort of operational things,
Yep.
build BPS, transportation, school start times, those things that are necessary
Yep.
for schooling to happen, but really aren't the core business of a school. The core business, hopefully, is the educational aspect and thinking about teaching and learning and moving from, a model where we've been doing schools since 1970 into more of a 21st century model. And what I'm wondering is, what would be your plan for moving both the internal conversation but also the community conversation out of the operational and into the educational?
So I think that there's two pieces here. In terms of making sure that school happens and that kids are learning, what is at the core of my core belief and the thing that I'm most focused on is making sure that there's great teachers that care and know their students and are providing them with high quality education. But there's also the reality that kids need to get to school on time, that there needs to be operational excellence, that kids need to get to school on time, that the buildings need to be cleaned, that the services are provided, that the cafeteria is ready so that kids eat in the morning. All those things that are operational are important because they impact learning. And to me, part of it is to make sure that the operations are crystal clear, that they're organized, that they're systematic, so that you can really remove the noise. And I think that that's something that has to happen for learning to take place. Oftentimes, and I know this happened to me as a teacher, somebody would say, okay, now you have to do this or you have to do that, and somebody else has to follow up on this. It's making sure that we're clear about whose role it is to make sure the operational excellence happens, so that then you can get to the forefronting 21st century, what I would say, applied learning models where kids are doing experiential learning, where they're doing internships, where they're doing more project-based things. But they go hand in hand, and we have to make sure that we take care of our bread and butter You don't want a parent who has to send their kid from East Boston to Dorchester for that bus to be late, then the parent's late to work. It causes dissonance. The student then feels a little bit out of place because he or she is late, they get marked tardy. So all those little things need to be operationalized, and the best way to do that is to be systematic about how you support excellence for operations so that you can get to the 21st century purposeful learning.
What would you do to push for that excellence?
Yeah, so the way that I would push for operational excellence is coming in as a new person, I would assess where we are, how we're doing with that. I would implement new strategies, and then you have to measure them. You have to say, how well are we doing the day-to-day things that we know are operationally important to make sure that the schools that the lights are on, that the buildings are cleaned. And then once we measure them, if they're not doing well, we need to modify. And we need to make sure that we do that quickly, because families expect excellence, and they need to have what I would say is a routine so that they can go on with their lives too. And students need that routine too. So it would be to be as clear and as direct as possible with our operational team that their work matters. And I would be remiss if I didn't say this, because it's something that's important to me. In every school that I've worked at, the secretaries, the bus drivers, the custodians, those are wonderful people who do a lot of good work, and they also need to get thanked and also need to be appreciated. And it's also, but if things are not working well, it's to make sure that you address them as quickly as possible, because they impact the learning.
Thank you. Tony, may I turn it to you?
Sure. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction here. We talk about the Boston Public Schools preparing young people for college and career. I hope certainly we're also preparing them for life.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about your perspective and experience with post-secondary pathways other than a traditional four-year liberal arts pathway.
Tony, that's important, because I don't know how many people really do the traditional four-year anymore with the cost and with the challenges and certain things. Most students are either working or really trying to figure out a way to be successful. And I can tell you that at Boston International, one of the things that I'm proud of is that we really started early college programs with certain schools to make sure that kids that were further along would be able to take classes at the early college levels to begin with their associates. We did that also at Randolph with Massasoit Community College and other places. We've done that at Cathedral, where students now are able to take classes with Bridgewater State and other programs. But I think that the key is to be forefronting, to look at our colleges to look at our high schools as early college partners. And I know that now a lot of our community colleges, kids can go to them for free who are high school graduates from the Boston Public Schools. That's a great way to build out badging and internship programs and to give kids those skill sets that they need, that are those soft 21st century skills, so that the learning doesn't just happen at the classroom level. And one of the ways that we've done that is we're currently working at Cathedral with Northeastern University to do badging for our students. A lot of our kids do internships, and they're getting incredible skills. They're learning how to present, they're learning time management, they're learning project management. And the key is, the reason why we want to make sure that we make this app-based and relational is so that students can really actually say, here's what I'm learning. Here are the skills that I'm gathering. And it's about credentialing. We know this. In order to get a job in Massachusetts right now, 50% of jobs require an associate's degree. And if we're not preparing students to start that early college pathway through high school, we're missing that opportunity. And those are things that I've done. I'm excited about doing those things. And it's something that I think it's absolutely necessary to recreate the way we look at high schools as early college destination centers.
Yes, Boston has one of the highest concentration of nonprofit organizations in the U.S. of any city. What's your commitment to investing in evidence-based programs versus those without proven outcomes?
Sean, I'm 100% in agreement with you that, from my perspective, they need to be evidence-based. And evidence-based is not everything just being quantitative. It's also qualitative. When we look at evidence, sometimes we just think about the numbers. There's a wonderful way to also make sure that we hear young people and we hear their voices, so it's quantitative and qualitative. Boston is rich in nonprofits and in philanthropy per capita, #1 in the entire country. And it's important for us to make sure, and the philanthropy want this. They want outcomes. They want evidence. I know this because at Cathedral, many of our programs, we raise over $4 million a year to make sure that inner city kids get a high quality education. And what they want is they want to make sure that scores are going up. They want to make sure that attendance is there. They want to make sure that students are learning more. They want to make sure that the programs that they're putting forth and that the hard-earned money that they're providing is getting the results that are agreed upon. And when they're not, again, you go back to modifying. You say, what did we do? What did we not do? What were some of the things that we need to do differently? The wonderful thing about having evidence and data is that it allows you to go back and look at the programs and recreate them, or figure out what were the bright spots, what were the things that worked, and what were some of the things that need some attention.
Thank you. Let's turn over to some of the public questions again. And the next one is, can you please describe your work on the Boston Compact and the role that you and your staff would play as a superintendent of Boston Public Schools?
When I arrived at Cathedral in 2013, Cathedral had already been part of the Boston Compact, which started in 2011. And the work that we have done with the Boston Compact at Cathedral has been important work in terms of looking at two things. One is, how do we provide great math instruction for African American and Latino students? And the other one is, how do we support the achievement gap for students that are doing well? And we've worked with other schools to look at best practices to support that work. I think that it's important, if I were superintendent, to make sure that we look at models of excellence in every sector. And models of excellence is programs that allow us to figure out what are the things that are working, and how do we make sure that those things that are working, we highlight them and celebrate them, study them, and then use them as models for other schools. And one of the things that I think we may have done often, at least in education, I don't know about Boston recently, is that we go outside to look at what's happening maybe in Chicago, or what's happening in Tennessee or somewhere else. We have to be very mindful of some of the great opportunities that we have locally, and to use those resources to look at models that are working. Going back to that conversation we had earlier about the status quo and maintaining the status quo, if we know that there's programs and ideas and innovations that are working 5 minutes down the street or 10 minutes down the street, it's really important to go look at them to support them, so that we could take them to scale at the Boston Public Schools.
Great, thank you. So there are a number of, I want to thank the audience for being so engaged and active in providing questions for this conversation with you, Dr. Santos. And there seems to be a lot of interest around your experience in Randolph Public Schools. And one of the questions is about the decision of the school committee in Randolph and renewal your contract. So they would want to know a little bit more about that process. Also, there are questions about, as you have the background as superintendent of Randolph Public Schools. So a second question would be, what lessons have you learned from that experience that you would apply to BPS? So the first one would be, tell us a little bit your decision to separate from Randolph Public Schools. And the second one would be, what did you learn in that role that you would apply to this one?
Good. So I'll take you back in time. When I arrived in Randolph in 2010, Randolph was a level 4 school district, which was about to be taken over by the state. When I knew this going in, and I was fine with that. Randolph is 86% of the students in Randolph are non-white. It was one of the most diverse communities, and that's why I wanted to go to Randolph. It was a job that I wanted because I knew that it was a place where I could make impact. When I arrived there, I saw that, again, the state had given us a number of things that were major challenges, and I just want to be a little explicit about. The first one was governance. The school committee and the town were not working well together. The second one was about K-12 curriculum. The third had to do primarily with special education and high-need students, and the fourth one had to do with resources. So it was a lot of major challenges. I went right into the district and took it on and did the work that I thought was really, really important. We made a lot of gains, as I've said, in terms of pushing forth with inclusion, making sure that we put forth an alternative ed program for students who had never graduated before, and I'm really proud of the work. When my time was going to come up to renew in Randolph, I let the school committee chair as well as the town manager know that I would be moving on. I had done the work that I did in Randolph. By the time I was ready to leave Randolph, none of our schools were level 4. 2 of our schools were level 2, and 4 of our schools were level 3. And at the time, the state said that Randolph was going to stay at level 4, and part of it had to do with governance. It was not because of academics. So that was the reason why I decided to leave Randolph. In terms of lessons learned from Randolph, one of the things that is good as a young leader is to be able to sometimes push back. When I arrived in Randolph, there were, as I said, the state was pretty heavy on Randolph. There were a lot of things that the Randolph Public Schools needed to do. If I could go back in time, I would push back a little bit on the state and say, listen, I understand that there's a lot of things, but in order to make sure that all these things get done, you need a little bit of time to make sure that people understand some of these things, because it really became, here's what you need to do to make sure that you work this out as quickly as possible. So those are, I don't know if I answered both of those questions. I hope I did.
Yeah, I think so. But let me actually follow up on
Sure.
something you just said. Boston is a bit different from Randolph and other public districts in that the school committee is not elected, it's appointed by the mayor.
Yep.
The mayor has significant amount of power in that decision, as well in the decisions made in Boston Public Schools. How would you, with the experience that you just mentioned in Randolph, how would you translate that in working both with the Boston Public Schools committee and the mayor?
One thing that I didn't mention was my relationship in Randolph with the town manager was excellent. And that's probably the closest relationship that I would say I would have with the mayor. The town manager and I met once a week, had an agenda, we worked on things, and we always called each other when we needed anything else. And we worked collaboratively, we respected each other, and we did a lot of good things together. So I think that would be the way that I would look at that in terms of the mayor. And my job would be to understand that the mayor's job is to be the champion of the entire city of Boston, and that my job is to be the champion for the school district, and that the principal's job is to be the champions for their schools, and that the families are the champions for their kids. So really creating those real specific clarity of what we're doing and then how, and building that plan together. So that's the way that I would work with the mayor. I would welcome that opportunity, because we do need to have that team. And in terms of the school committee, working with the school committee is similar to the way I work with my board of trustees right now. I've been fortunate that I have had the opportunity to work with a school committee, which was an appointed school committee, and with a board of trustees with 24 board members. The goals are always about being clear, directive, deliverable in terms of our academic goals, our financial goals, and I enjoy working with committees because it helps you to really get better and to support the work that needs to happen.
Thank you. So let me just continue with
Yeah,
the number
sure.
of questions from the public. We have about 36 minutes left in our conversation, so maybe a few more of these questions and then turn it over to any final burning questions from our panel before we hear your closing remarks.
Sure.
Does that work?
Perfect.
Great, thank you. There's a question, an interesting question here that says, gentrification and charter schools are bleeding our school system. That's the opinion of the person who wrote this question. So the question is, what would you do to prevent students' loss to charter schools?
If I were to be the superintendent of the schools of Boston, I understand that my job is just to make sure that families have choice and that they pick where they want their kids to go to school. That's number one. Number two, what I would really focus on is making sure that I improve our schools as much as possible. In every single role that I've been, either a principal, a headmaster, or a superintendent, our enrollment has increased. Our academics have increased. And I believe the reason for that is because I advocate for kids, I advocate for families, and we get quality results. So that's the first thing that I would do to make sure that I support that. Secondly, I would work as hard as possible with the legislature, with Chapter 70, because we know this, the way our funding formula works right now is obsolete. As we mentioned earlier, when you have $220 million that are coming from state aid and about $167 million goes to charters, that's a difficult challenge for the city of Boston. And that's something that you don't just take schools offline when that happens. I don't think people understand that. They say, well, the money just goes this way. It's not about that. You already have fixed costs when you're operating a school. You've hired staff, you have building facilities. So those things do not go away. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the conversation. And I think that that's something that's critical. Secondly, my job would be to be a tireless advocate and champion for the city of Boston, to let the legislature know, and to let many people in the community. This is where parents, students, this is something that everyone, I believe, is coalescing around, that we do need to make sure that we get different types of funding from the state. So that would be the work that I would push for. And last but not least, it's not to say that one is better than the other, but it's our job to make sure that I support the Boston Public Schools to be the best that we can be, so that families want to be with us and want to stay with us.
Great, thank you. Another question from the public. BPS has largely eliminated standardized testing across the district, other than what the state and the federal government require. Would you keep this policy? Why or why not?
I'm not sure what standardized testing they've gotten rid of or not. So can you repeat that again, please?
Sure. BPS has largely eliminated standardized testing across the district, except for what is required by the state.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So would you keep this policy? Why or why not?
I'm a big fan of assessing. When I was a teacher, one of the things that I loved doing more than anything else was to assess my students on Fridays. So I would sit down with kids and I would say, here's what we need to know by next week. Please let me know where you are, what you're doing, and I would take the weekend to plan my lessons, to organize myself, to make sure that I was able to meet students' needs. So I'm not the way that I'm trying to answer this question is by letting you know that I'm not a huge proponent of testing, but I am a strong advocate for assessing where kids are. And what I mean by that is that you provide students with quarterly opportunities to support their work. At Boston International, we had, I believe, an amazing policy where we pushed really hard to make sure that a student got no less than a 70. And part of that was by making sure that we were clear, here's what you need to know by the end of the quarter. And we had teachers staying after school, kids coming in on Saturdays, students supporting each other, and that to me is critical, to be clear with kids about what the expectations are, whether it's 3rd grade, 5th grade, 7th grade, and making sure that you're assessing that throughout the school year, because data is critical. In terms of testing for the sake of testing, I'm not a big fan of it. I think that we're spending too much time doing testing for students that is not, in many ways, real-time data. And what I'm talking about real-time data is assessing what kids are learning, how do you regroup and support that work on a weekly basis, versus an assessment that you give and you get the data back 3 to 6 months later. That to me is not helpful to teachers, not helpful to kids, and in many ways short-sighted, because it's just one assessment in one moment in time, which I don't think is helpful.
Thank you. In Boston, we are experiencing decaying and mismanagement of facilities that are aging. What is your experience with major facilities repair and upkeep?
One of the things that I'm proud of is we just finished constructing a 15,000 square foot building at Cathedral. It's called the Applied Learning Center. And when you work in an independent philanthropy-based school, you are it. So I know a lot about this. I know how to work with architects. I know how to work with engineers. I know how to look at sewer systems. It is incredible the amount of work that, learning that I've done with Shaman Construction and, well, I shouldn't be mentioning them, but with construction companies to really understand that work and making sure that it wasn't just something that you do on the operational side, it was also the visioning part, where we brought in, as I said earlier, the students so that they could be part of what does our theater studio need to look like? What does our applied learning center and our makerspace look like? So getting voice from students and families to do the visioning session, I think is absolutely critical. But then it's paying attention to the cost. I'm proud to say that we were, I believe, right on budget, maybe about 1% to 2% over our cost. And I know this because we had this at our last finance meeting. So it's something that it's really important to make sure that that you know that work and that your team knows that work. You don't need to know everything, but you need to be able to ask enough questions about how things are being put together and what that looks like.
Thank you. As an alum, this is a question for you as an alum from BPS. Since leaving BPS, way back when,
Yeah.
what are the areas of growth and areas of success that you have seen in the system?
I left the Boston Public Schools in 2010, and some of the things that I've seen that have been successes for the Boston Public Schools is the graduation rate is at 72%, 72.4 to be exact. I believe in 2007 it was at 57.2, so that's an incredible improvement. The other improvement that I see this, and it's, again, this could be qualitative, but and maybe it's quantitative too, but I see a lot more investment in families. I see a lot more voices. I see a lot more interest in our schools. A perfect example of that is the BSAC with young people having an app to make sure that they have information out for each other. So those things I think have been incredible improvements. The other improvement that I was actually on the beginning stages of this when I was on the negotiation teams was the weighted student formula. I think that that's a wonderful thing if done well. To make sure that it's done strategically and organized to support how we make the system more equitable. And the other thing that I think has been incredible work has been done on this. I haven't seen it directly, but I started I was the first person to start the achievement gap with the district. I was one of the co-chairs. And the work that has been done in terms of looking at the opportunity index, in terms of looking at culturally responsive teaching and practices, those are all things that are really, I think, very good and things that need to be celebrated.
Right, thank you. What is your position on ensuring that teaching staff represents the student demographics of the city? How will you achieve teacher diversity within BPS?
Yeah, that's a critical aspect of learning, and I'll say this, I'll preface it by saying that diversity is good for all students. It's not just for Latino and African Americans. Diversity is good for all students. And it's good for all students for three reasons. Number one, it provides them empathy, it provides models of what the world looks like, and it prepares them for 21st century learning. As we know, the city of Boston is a city of immigrants. The fastest growing population in the city of Boston, 61% of the growth is coming from immigrant populations. So it's about preparing people for what the world is and what it looks like. In terms of Boston, I do see some of the concerns. I know that 42% of our students are ELL, Spanish or Latino, and we have about 11% of staff, and then for African American, again, it's 34% and 22. So if you look at the big numbers, 76% of our Latino and African American students are being serviced by 33% of their teachers. So that's something that we need to do and be really methodical about. I think that there's three ways to address that. One is a program that I was a part of a long time ago, which is the Teach Boston program. I don't know if it still exists, but it was a program to recruit high school and kids who wanted to go into education and wanted to be teachers. It was a wonderful program. I know some kids who actually are now teachers in Boston, and one of them is actually a principal in Boston, so I know that the program works. The other thing is working with colleges and universities, whether it's the Donovan program at Boston College, the Teach Next Year program at UMass, looking at those pipelines and then building out our own programs. I was a coach for the MEOC program, Men of Color, in the city of Boston, so I did that for a couple of years. And it's also about being intentional, not just recruiting, but retaining. And that's something that's that's really, really important in Boston. It's creating affinity groups and making sure that the diverse staff feels welcome and supported, because it's not just about getting them in the door. It's making sure that they stay and that they feel connected. I had this challenge in Randolph. When I arrived in Randolph, my central office team, including principals, department chairs, and central office staff, including myself, we were 10% diverse. By the time I left Randolph, we were at 35%. I'm really proud of that, because it gave the community a real sense of there are people here. The Director of Family and Community Engagement looks like me, understands me, has my background, knows where I come from. Our athletic director, our director of security, our new special education director. So those are things that I think are important. As a leader, you really try to push as much as possible to do diversity. One of the things that I think is good about Boston is that with the plan that we have in place, where we want to really eliminate and close the achievement gap, I think that allows, that gives us a sense of people who want to come and do something. It's about your values. So those are ways that I would go about recruiting and retaining.
Let me, since you're talking about this and you have professional experience working with ELL students, what approach will you implement to eliminate the achievement and opportunity gap for English language learners?
This is something that's very dear to me, that I did my dissertation on this. I studied my school. I taught at English high school. I ran the achievement gap policy work. And there's maybe 4 or 5 key things. Number one is that you are very clear about knowing who your students are. And what I mean by that is that there are students who are long-term English language learners who've been in this country for a long time and do not have academic language. There are students who are recently arrived, similar to some of the students that we had at Boston International, who were older English language learners. Some of those older English language learners had strong native language. They may have been from Albania, they may have been from, it didn't even matter, Albania, Ethiopia, Somalia, and came with strong literacy. And then there were some students who came who did not have strong literacy. And some of those students had interrupted education. So knowing who your students are is absolutely critical. The Look Act, I think, allows you to have a little bit of flexibility with that, which I think is really important. The second thing is, and this is for all students, special education, English language learners, anybody, it's making sure that you have top-notch, high-quality education, that you have the mass frameworks, that you have the mass core. And the reason for that is because it allows everybody to have at least a playing field. Here is what the expectations are. And with English language learners, it's important that you provide more time, that you make things theme-based. And what I mean by that is that you have teams of teachers working together so that you're building academic literacy, not just in math class, but in English class and in history class. So what we did at Boston International, we had a house system approach. All the teachers worked together, and we had a system that was called Opportunity to Learn, which basically means here are the kids' needs. Here are the opportunities that they need to be able to be successful. I was really proud of the fact that when you walked into Boston International High School, we had a sign that said, "Welcome to Boston International High School," where we don't say students can't. We say this student may not be able to do this right now, and this is what we are doing about it. And that, to me, is when you get a staff to be collaborative, to be supportive, and to make sure that we don't give up on kids. And to me, that's what I call accountability. It's being accountable as the headmaster, it's being accountable with your teams, and it's being accountable with the teachers. So those would be the things that I would put forth to support English language learners.
Thank you. So when you think, this is kind of a related question to, the diversity questions that you have discussed before. When you think about the BPS student demographics, what is one well-represented group with which you are culturally competent or feel culturally competent with? And what is one group where your cultural competency is still growing? And how do you nurture that growth?
I was very fortunate that from 1996 to 2003, I taught at English high school. And I taught multilingual students how to read and write. I had students from pretty much every single part of the world. Cape Verde, and I learned the difference between Fogo and Praia, Eritrea and Ethiopia, Somalia. I had students pretty much from everywhere. And that was an incredible learning experience for me. As a result, I went back to school to get a master's in linguistics so that I could really help become a more effective teacher with my students. Growing up in Boston, I grew up on Columbia Road. I grew up with African Americans, Latinos, Cape Verdeans. Those are my friends. They're still my friends. When you played sports, you went to different parts of the city, whether it was to East Boston, whether it was to Rosendale, Jamaica Plain. So I feel confident in the city of Boston. I know the culture of the city of Boston. To tell you that I'm more comfortable with one versus another, I don't view cultural competence that way. I am connected with people because I care. I'm culturally responsive myself. If I look at perhaps a demographic group that I have not had as much, what I would say interaction would be with the Asian community, but I did intern with Bak Fang, who was my mentor. So I feel confident that Boston is a world-class city of immigrants, and I'm an immigrant, and it's an immigrant story, and it's just how do you connect with people. So I feel pretty comfortable in connecting with different cultures. And part of that is being humble enough to ask questions and being humble enough to learn and to be curious enough to respect human differences and perspectives and to learn from others.
Thank you. Do a quick time check here. I think we have time for another
Sure.
question from the public, and maybe if there's anything from the panel, we have maybe one or two more questions. This question tries to get at the issue of truancy and student attendance. It's a yes or no question, and I will add something, some editorial.
Okay.
If the person who put this question forth doesn't mind. There are only 5 attendance officers for the city of Boston. Would you add more attendance officers? And I would add to the question, what would be your strategy to engage students that have attendance issues or challenges?
So my answer is yes, and I believe we have more than 5 attendance officers. And the reason why I believe that is because when I was a headmaster at Boston International High School, I was an attendance officer. And many of our high school principals were attendance officers. They may have not had the term attendance officers, but I know what they did. They would call kids, they would meet with families, and they would really push to make sure that they support them. To answer your question, I don't know the exact number of how many students are tardy and certain things like that, but if the numbers require more attendance officers, the answer is yes. And the reason for that is because when kids are not in school, they're not learning, and they're more likely to get themselves in trouble. The second thing is to really find out the why. Sometimes we really want to focus on how we're going to do this and what we're going to do. The real question is, why are kids not coming to school? And I'm going to give you, I'm going to date myself back to 1998 when Pedro Noguera did work with us at English High School. And we thought that students were not coming to school because they were disengaged and not learning. When we did the data, we found out that our most advanced students and kids that were doing the best academically were the kids who were missing the most school. And part of that was that we found out, wow, we are not challenging kids as much as possible. And the reason why I think that that's important is because we need to find out why kids are not coming to school. And how we do that is through dialogue, through relationships. There was a great article in the New York Times maybe about a month ago, Meta and Fine. They did a study with about 1 million kids, high school kids. And they found out that most kids, 75% of kids, felt that they were bored and not engaged in school. And when they walked around, and they did this throughout many different schools, what they found out was that where kids found themselves most engaged and most excited was in debate classes, in programming, coding, acting, doing arts, theater, and part of that is to find out how do we make our schools more forefronting and more applicable to our kids' needs and their personal passions. So I know that this was a short yes/no answer. The answer is yes, we need more attendance officers, but the real challenge for me is why are kids not coming to school?
Okay, thank you. So let me just now come back to the panel. If there are any additional questions that you would like to ask before we turn it over for closing remarks. Kristen, is there something that you were burning questions?
I have one. You just talked about the kinds of schools that engage young people.
Yes.
And you also talked about diversifying school leaders and bringing new people to the table. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what your strategy is for attracting and developing a team of people who are going to deliver on the kind of education you just said was so important for young people.
Kristen, a couple of things. First is to really look at some of the wonderful things that are already happening here in Boston. I had the most, an excellent visit just a couple of months ago. I went to the Elliott School. I'm like, you know how some people like to go to the gym and do certain things? I'm like a school rat. I like going to schools and seeing what's going on. So when I was there, I just saw kids coding, programming, doing amazing things. Maybe like about a month ago, I was at the Devers School. And I got to tell you that it warmed my heart to see what was a social emotional class with students with special ed needs supporting each other and caring for each other. You want to talk about real restorative justice and kids supporting each other? It was something that absolutely warmed my heart. So there are a lot of good things that are going on. So that's number one. I think we need to highlight those bright spots and work on them and build them out. Secondly, there's a lot of wonderful people here in the city of Boston who are either retired principals, headmasters, professors, people who really care about this work. When I was at Boston International, Maria Brisk from Boston College trained our entire staff on how to work with English language learners. There's people who really want to give back and support us. So part of it is to look within and to train people. One of the things that I pride myself on is being a good teacher. And if people are willing and determined, they can get there. So we can attract, we have some of that here, and we can build people's capacity with good work. The other piece is to make Boston a forefronting city that really does close the achievement and opportunity gap. With you, with us, with the work that we're doing, that attracts people who want to be a part of something that's great. And last but not least, it's making sure that you focus on the things that matter. Sometimes when you think about creating a great school, you need to make sure that you listen to the people who are living in it, the teachers, the students, and the parents, and the principals. The people who are leading it in the district or trying to help lead it, central offices, we need to make sure that the people who are living it really have that voice so that then we can provide support. And then last but not least, when you talk about people who are lending a hand, the philanthropy and others, it's to make sure that it's guided back on what's happening at the school. So to answer your question, we would do it together with voice and ownership and with models of bright spots.
Thank you, Oscar.
Yes, a couple of things. The first is, I'll go to this one. Earlier you said something about, programs that are working and should be scaled. As superintendent, what would your commitment be to creating guardrails for those programs within the district so schools who want such programs have the availability to have them and are not just wasting their dollars on things that are not effective? And I'll go to this next question around central office has made big investments in new initiatives, but individual schools have been left to pick up the tab moving forward without the adequate resources that we talked about. What do you think the balance between investments from the district versus investments from individual schools should be? And should resources be centralized or decentralized?
Two things. When you talk about guardrails for programs, when programs are working, you have to provide those guardrails because that's why we're in the business of this. You have to hold true to say, we have a Saturday Academy, which we did at Boston International High School, by the way, and kids came on Saturdays. Their attendance was excellent. It was almost 100%. And I'll tell you why, because they had great teachers and they had people that cared about them. So you fight for those things. That's an investment that at the school level you make, and you push the district to make sure that that happens. And you invite people to come and see, this is why this works and this is why this matters. As a superintendent, that would be my job. There's 3 types of data. There's count data, you can look at the numbers. There's hear data, here's what you're looking at. But then there's that see data. When you go see it with your own eyes and you get central office people out of the central offices to go see what's happening in schools, it gives them a better sense and a better opportunity to understand, wow, we need to fight for this program. It makes sense. To your second question about whether you decentralize resources or centralize them, I think you have to do a little bit of both, because the way our budget primarily works is that, you know, when you look at the $1.1 billion that we have, 65% of it is already allocated to the schools. 25% goes to services. So part of it is to really look at what are the special programs that we really are building that we need to support and that we need to either get more resources for or make a more compelling argument for, because it's supporting our kids. And that's where families and kids, and going back to that whole discussion about not dealing with the status quo, it's about making sure that there's grassroots support for those programs, and that those programs truly need to be, in many ways, not just school-based. When we look at high schools, we really need to think about high schools as almost like campuses, so that if somebody has a great coding program at another school and somebody has a great writing lab somewhere else, why can't kids get on the bus? Why can't kids get on the train? We look at seat time as a way of this is where kids need to be all the time. We have, right now, a lot of high schools, and if we do these schools well and we organize them, we can say to kids, you can go here, here's where you go for that. Not every single school can have every single thing in them. I think that that's not feasible or economically possible. So that's how I would address some of the centralized and decentralized budget.
Thank you.
Connie, you have our final question of the day.
Okay, great. So one of the things that I think we are lucky to have in Massachusetts and Boston in particular is a high degree of interest on the part of businesses in education.
Yeah.
And I'm at an educational institution myself, which works with businesses all the time, and it is sometimes a mixed blessing because often people in education and people in business speak different languages.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear what you have to say about the stake that businesses have in education, the role that they would play, and what they have to offer to education.
Yeah. Anthony, this is a great question, and the reason being is because in many ways, the businesses need education just as much as we need them. And it's about how do you create an interdependent approach to bridge the divide between industry and academics. And the way that you do that, the MASCA has a perfect example of what, you know, the 21st century skills that kids need to learn. Those are things that need to be taught in schools and need to be taught in the business world too. You know, in an ideal world, I believe that high schools should have 21st century learning skills and development, and it should be done at a internship-based approach at a business. And the second piece that I think, again, this is not something that's available right now, but to really be forefronting and think about what are kids' passions and interests, and how do we make sure that we provide that workforce development or that job shadowing. There's a great study, The Unfinished Business by the Annenberg Institute, that talked about the fact that for kids to graduate and do well in college and beyond, there were 4 power standards. Number 1, that they had the mass core. We can do that. Number 2, that kids had 2.7 GPA. That's something we have to work on. That they're in school 94% of the time. Doesn't have to be seat time all the way every single day here. But the 4th one was one that we do really well at Cathedral, is just to provide kids internships and workforce development opportunities. And that's the hook that I think needs to happen with businesses. I'll give you a perfect example. We have students who go to a marketing firm that's close to our school. They're creating the marketing strategy for the school. They then have an opportunity to say, I'm giving back, I'm doing something. We have kids working with Tufts Medical. They're gonna be doing a science expo to share with the community. So part of it is to make the learning purposeful so that the industry, business understands, wow, there is a social element to this too, so that it's not just business, the way that we kind of look at business. So that's the way that I would go about bridging the divide. And in Boston, this would be something that would need to be done really well with an innovation and entrepreneurship point person, because this is not something that can just be done haphazardly.
Question. Thank you so much. So I think that, we're coming to the end of our time together.
Sure.
I want to thank our panelists and for very thoughtful questions, as well as the audience for all the questions that were submitted. At this point, I want to give you an opportunity, Dr. Santos, to give us some closing remarks before we end our time together today.
Sure. So first of all, I want to say thank you for your wonderful questions, and thank you to the audience, too, for your questions. I am always excited and motivated when we talk about schools working with communities and community partners. The idea of schools being able to do this all by themselves is a myth that has never worked. In order for us to have kids, schools, and our city succeed, we need to work together. My whole concept is one Boston, one focus, great schools for all. And these great schools don't all have to be the same, but we need to make sure that every great school has community partners, that they have wonderful people like you and others throughout the city of Boston to support this work. I'm committed to this work. I'm from the city of Boston. I've built relationships over the last 25 years that are meaningful relationships with teachers, with parents, with students, with business organizations, and I would love to make sure that some of these ideas and thoughts that we've had today come into fruition if I were to be chosen as your superintendent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santos, for your time. We wish you the best in this process, and thank you for being here today and the rest of the day with other panels. Before we close, I want to remind the audience that they can learn more about the candidates and submit their feedback at superintendent@bostonpublicschools.org. That's an email address, superintendentsearch@bostonpublicschools.org. You can also provide feedback via a survey that you can find at on BPS website at bostonpublicschools.org/superintendent search. That's a mouthful, but if you go to the website, you'll find it. The survey will remain open until midnight on Sunday, April 28th, and we encourage each one of you watching on live stream and here to provide your feedback through these two processes. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Santos.
Thank you.